social controls, the easiest way to think about it's the constrained view of human behavior, which is something that writers like Thomas Sowell mention. It goes back to kind of classical thinking, and the idea is that it's through rules and norms that people are controlled. Those get shaped in the family, shaped in schools, neighborhoods, by the larger society. And that without those rules and norms that kind of constrain us, that human behavior's natural tendency is to be self-centered idea. In the last 5 years, people have kind of forgotten.
This is Manhattan Insights, a Manhattan Institute production. I'm Rafael Mangual, the Nick O'Neill Fellow here at the Manhattan Institute, where I work primarily with the Policing and Public Safety Initiative. And I am delighted to be today's guest host. My guest today is University of Pennsylvania criminologist, Professor John MacDonald. Professor MacDonald currently focuses much of his work and research at the intersection of crime and place. He's done fascinating work exploring ways in which public safety can be enhanced through urban planning initiatives, particularly initiatives that render the built environment less conducive to criminal activity. But his work in the field of criminology is wide-ranging. It began as a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland in the late 1990s. And today, our conversation is going to explore how the field of criminology has changed in the past quarter century and why so many criminologists seem to have lost sight of the importance of what researchers in the field call social control. Professor MacDonald, welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here. Look forward to our conversation.
Yeah. I'm actually really gratified to be hosting you. You just recently hosted me at the University of Pennsylvania, where I was able to engage with some of your students and give a talk about my book. So thank you very much for doing that, and glad to be able to repay the favor by having you here in this venue. So you wrote a fascinating essay I just really, really loved. And it's titled Social Control Works. And I just, it was interesting because as is so often the case, some of the most interesting things you read are kind of obvious things that are just told in a really compelling way. And so that I think, can really function as the focus of today's conversation. But I think the best place to start is for people who, aren't criminologists, for people who aren't sociologists, who aren't familiar with the literature. Why don't you start by telling us what social control is?
So social control's kind of the easiest way to think about it's the constrained view of human behavior, which is something that writers like Thomas Sowell mention. But it goes back, it's an ancient idea, goes back to kind of classical thinking, and the idea is that society constrains us. It's through rules and norms that, that people are controlled. Those get shaped in the family, shaped in schools, neighborhoods, by the larger society. And that without those rules and norms that kind of constrain us, that human behavior's natural tendency is to be self-centered, self-interested, hedonistic. And this is not really disputed. I mean, there's some disputes in the field, but this is an old idea in sociology that goes back, to the beginning of sociology. But it's an idea that seems in the last, 5 years, people have kind of forgotten.
So what are some sort of common examples of social control that the layperson might very readily understand? So maybe something that comes to my head is like detention for a student in school, being grounded by your parents, and perhaps at the more sort of extreme end, say a jail sentence or a prison sentence. Am I on the right track there?
Yeah, you are. I mean, there's the informal social control, which are things like, your parents, your neighbors, even the school, and then formals like the state. So, that when the criminal justice system kicks in, you can think of spectrum. Social control starts early, parents setting rules and telling their kids that, if they misbehave, that there's going to be consequences. And also social control isn't just about constraining. It's also about developing a sense of kind of an emotional bond between an individual, their family, their society, a sense that they really have a stake in conforming behavior.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's interesting because, everything that you say sounds so basic, so straightforward, so obvious, so intuitive. And yet, as you and I both know, there is a lot of discomfort with this idea of social control. There's a lot of opposition to policy initiatives that, sort of emphasize social control. I mean, I was just recently testifying a couple weeks ago before the Civil Rights Commission, and on the panel alongside me was a scholar who's at the Vera Institute for Justice, which is, very sort of reform-oriented organization. I think they're based here in New York. And she said something that was really interesting, almost galling, actually. She spoke just after I did, and I made some remarks about incarceration and its importance in the overall sort of, public safety strategic plans of various cities. And she said, well, incarceration we know doesn't work because, obviously the United States incarcerates so many people. And so, by that logic, we shouldn't have any crime whatsoever. And I just remember thinking, man, she must really feel confident in this view, saying this in such a public forum. And, it really has gotten me thinking as I was preparing for this conversation. I mean, what do you think are kind of the dominant strands of thought that have led so many people in the world of criminology, in the world of, criminal justice policy making, to be so uncomfortable about social control? I mean, what is it that leaves a bad taste in their mouth, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is the label. The idea of control. People who are adverse to the idea of punishment or would like to think that, human behavior doesn't require some form of consequences. They're uncomfortable with the term. I think it also has to do with the fact that just, we lived through almost a 20-year period of really low crime rates in America. And so the shift in the field went from studying a lot about the causes of crime to kind of the inequality in criminal justice. And, I've been studying inequality in criminal justice as well for over 20 years, but it wasn't in the late 1990s. This wasn't like a common focus of scholarship. It was more people were really focused on trying to understand crime, its causes, and its consequences. And I think as the field and other fields have kind of gotten interested in criminal justice reform, people have stopped really focusing on what causes crime and instead of focus just on kind of the consequences of crime and often, policies that they would prefer. And so they're, kind of resistant to, evidence that might run counter to what they'd like to happen in the policy arena. But yeah, in some ways, all I'm doing is bringing back kind of an old idea. Travis Hershey, who is a giant in the field, his whole career is around social control. There are a lot of sociologists and criminologists writing about social control, and in the last 10 years, it's really just kind of people aren't focusing on this explanation. I mean, Rob Sampson, who's a well-known scholar at Harvard, all of his work is about social control. It's about informal social control, neighborhoods, even
the family.
The family. The work on why people desist from crime tends to focus on social control, stable work, good intimate relationship. But in the last, 10 years, I'd say that it's just you've seen this shift that people really don't want to focus on those factors. They'd rather focus on other potential causes.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like what I'm hearing you say is that this is partly a function of us being a victim of our own success, right? The 1990s saw this just radical decline in violence particularly, but in crime generally. In New York City, we had like 100,000 robberies in 1990. That number is probably down 80 to 85%, from that high point. And, cities across the country, just saw really steep declines in crimes like homicides and, shootings, et cetera. And so I think that probably leads us to a place in which there's a sort of incongruity between, a posture in which we're focusing heavily on controlling would-be offenders, and the world in which we occupy, which is one in which the problem of offending is not nearly as big as it used to be. And so, I can certainly understand why, at least for some scholars, there's been a shift away from that focus. But I also think, there's definitely been something less tangible in the world of criminology. As someone, who's on the outside kind of looking in, but writing in these spaces for a long time, it just seems to me like a lot of old ideas in criminology are just understood to be things that we have to get away from, irrespective of what the evidence says about them. This idea that, whatever piece comes from, things like policing and incarceration in particular, we should be uncomfortable with that piece, and we should, be sort of, to take Patrick Sharkey's book title, uneasy about, the byproducts of those kinds of institutions that have really focused on controlling offenders. And, it does seem like there has been a sort of ideological shift away from, any role, recognizing any role for the state in sort of responding to crime and trying to prevent it through enforcement. And more, there's a kind of larger focus on this idea that we should understand the roots of crime and try and get at it in ways that don't involve, the state. I mean, are you seeing that from within the field? I mean, you're at these conferences, you're in probably one of the most prestigious criminology departments in the country. I mean, what's your sense of the field itself, and particularly over the last, 10, 20 years?
Yeah, I think you're onto something. I mean, has happened is more and more of the field of criminology, people are interested in social justice causes. They're, interested in understanding inequality more than the cause of crime. And we used to have vociferous debates about what caused crime, and but spirited ones, across the ideological spectrum. And that really, if you look at the program at American Society of Criminology, you don't see that kind of debate, that kind of range of opinions anymore. And I think it's part of it is people are just uncomfortable with any kind of social control from the state. They might be more comfortable within the family, but even then they're like, well, is there a way that we could focus on still the inequality, the so-called root causes? But I think it connects back to an idea that James Q. Wilson wrote about in Thinking About Crime, where he talks about the root cause of crime. I think calls it the causal fallacy, which is even if you believe there are so-called root causes, it doesn't mean you can actually change those very easily or even at all. And so if you're thinking about, what margins you can actually change from policy, there's a group of us that do kind of applied policy work that are really interested in yes, does more police or less police or, changes in incarceration policy, can these things actually move, can changes in school discipline, change behavior, can teaching kids to sit still, you think about programs like, the basic Perry preschool program, basic ideas like teaching kids self-control. The field's moved away from those kinds of focus to focusing more on, we need to get to the root. But then not really the connection back to, okay, well, even if you can uncover those, what can you do about it? And I think it's part of it is that the policy options, there's no solutions, they're just trade-offs. And so sometimes people don't like that. They want a solution that makes them feel comfortable. I mean, that's at least my sense of it.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I kind of came into this field through James Q. Wilson in many ways. I mean, him, George Kelling, John DeLuglio, those were sort of the first handful of scholars that, whose work I encountered as I sort of started thinking about these topics more deeply. And as I read, Wilson in particular, to me, one of the most interesting points that he made, and the thing that he helped me see kind of right off the bat was, again, kind of, you sort of said this, but irrespective of whether you think crime is caused by, economic inequality or poverty or unemployment, the reality is that, and I knew this with hindsight, reading what Wilson was saying in the 80s, but we got through the 1990s and early 2000s without solving any of those problems. Right? I mean, New York City in 1990 had 2,262 murders, and we got that number down to 292 by 2017. I mean, poverty didn't go anywhere. Unemployment didn't go anywhere. Inequality probably grew over that period of time. In fact, it probably grew substantially. And so, it's just interesting to me that there was such a focus in the field on sort of these root causes when it was very clear that irrespective of whether you got at those root causes, we knew how to treat the symptoms. And to the extent that you can sort of extend the metaphor and if society's the patient, you can make the patient better, without necessarily understanding what causes the cancer, right? You can treat it. Chemotherapy works. And that was kind of, sort of how I, shaped my thinking about these issues. And, but you're right. I mean, there was a lot of robust debate, about the degree to which crime was a function of, socioeconomic factors versus, say the family and the intergenerational transmission of antisocial behavior. And, but you mentioned Dr. Soul earlier in our discussion. And, as you were talking just now, it brought to mind another one of his works, A Conflict of Visions. And it does seem like within the world of criminology, there is this conflict of sort of two dominant visions, one in which you have people who believe sincerely that you can rewrite the code of human nature, right? That you can figure out what makes people want to offend and change them. And then you have, people who maybe accept that offending is just something that's going to be with us, and we should really prioritize the things that we know work, given historical evidence, to make sure that we can minimize the costs associated with that inevitable offending. I mean, is that right? Is there a third strand I'm missing? And if so, where do you kind of fall there?
Yeah, I would say you're right. I mean, there's been this tension going back to the even early 70s of people saying, crimes caused by social inequality or other social forces, they interact with psychology. And so that's kind of the unconstrained view. It's that society causes crime by peer groups, by neighborhoods that actually teach people to commit crime. And then there's Travis Hershey and others who are arguing, no, it's those things happen anyway, and it's the constrained. So that is those are conflicting visions of human nature. And when I teach crim theory, I actually go through this with people. I say you have to think about what are the underlying assumptions of each theory. And, do you buy it? What's the empirical evidence? But also, do you have to see how sometimes theories are incompatible with each other? So those are kind of conflicting views. I'd say the only kind of third element is the kind of biosocial argument, because that one almost often doesn't take either position. It's just kind of like there's a mechanism in the brain physiologically, and maybe we can change it by just muting whatever that mechanism is. And so that one tends to be kind of more agnostic about, what the underlying cause, from a philosophical standpoint.
Yeah, the biosocial explanation is one in which I've been wanting to do more research on my own. I mean, the little I've read about it, my sense is basically like to whatever extent there's a biosocial component, it probably doesn't explain a big chunk of offending patterns. And so, there's a sort of limited utility in how much time and energy we focus on sort of identifying those things. But
yeah, I think they're worth identifying if it's something that's particularly pernicious that you can think of environmentally you could change. But we can't have, between 2019 and 2020, you didn't have a doubling in the murder rate in cities because people's brains changed suddenly. You didn't have the 1990s crime drop. I mean, there is some evidence about lead coming out of gasoline, but you see it. But and so maybe that provides partial explanation, but it was true across all cohorts. So I mean, I think that there's a piece to that there, but it probably just interacts with the environment anyway. So it's like, who's eating lead paint chips? It's in particularly poor, disadvantaged homes where kids are also probably not being monitored as much. So I mean, these things, I think the enthusiasm for biosocial is because the mechanism is much some way it's complicated. It's more complicated than people realize, but it seems more convincing, especially to a lay audience. Like, oh, I can see that. If we just changed X,
Right.
If we give people
It's less
vitamin
judgmental
pills,
too,
yeah.
I think, for some people.
It's less judgmental for some people. Although depending, if you start thinking, people start arguing that there's like a genetic, a crime gene or something, then that can be very judgmental. But I mean, we're so far away from that, and there's clearly no evidence there's such thing as like a crime gene. I mean, for a variety of reasons. Again, that wouldn't make any sense because you wouldn't have these big ups and downs in the crime rate because the genes don't change that fast.
Right. Exactly. So your essay, which, I really, really think everyone who's listening to this just needs to take some time to read. It's just excellent. It's incredibly well done. But as I was reading it, there was one line in there that jumped out at me at the sort of the front end of the essay where you talk about the 7 indisputable facts about crime and offending. And I remember thinking like, wow, are there only 7 things that we know about crime and offending? But I think as people read the essay and go through those 7 things, it'll become apparent, just how wise that is. And I'm going to list through them, but I want us to kind of run through some of these in a little more detail. So the 7 indisputable facts about crime and offenders, according to John MacDonald, are concentration of crime at place, right? So crime is very, very hyper concentrated geographically. The concentration of crime at sort of time, day, and season, right? So it's, again, very intuitive to a lot of people, but if you're talking about, violent crime in particular, you're likely to see that in the summer, on the weekends, and at night. The concentration of crime among high rate offenders, kind of a Pareto distribution within the criminal offending community. A very small group of offenders are sort of driving the majority of the offenders. The concentration of the social causes of crime, which, again, makes a lot of sense if you sort of step back and understand, for example, that crime is concentrated at place. Well, if the costs associated with crime are sort of stuck to the places in which those crimes occur, well, then so too are the costs of crime going to be geographically concentrated. You talk about the age crime curve, which for a lay audience just basically refers to the aging out, particularly of violent crime. Although, sometimes what we see is that criminal offending patterns extend for very long periods of time, very big chunks of lives, but will move into sort of less aggressive crime categories. And non-specialization of offenders, which is number 6. Criminals don't specialize. This tends to be a sort of misapprehension that lots of lay people have. They think, see movies like Gone in 60 Seconds, and they think that every criminal is just sort of an expert at that one thing, right? They're a bank robber, or they're a car thief, or they're a drug dealer, when in reality, it's kind of much broader than that. And then finally, that offending occurs within very tight-knit social networks. So those are the 7 indisputable facts about crime and offenders. And I think it's a pretty comprehensive list, especially when you sort of zoom out and think about it. But I want to kind of lump in the first few of these, which is the concentration of crime at place among high rate offenders and, within certain time frames. I mean, what does that do to the argument about the sort of justice and social justice within the field of criminology? I mean, how should we think about social justice when we know, for example, that it's a very sort of discrete cross-section of the community that is sort of suffering the brunt of this particular social problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is, and I mentioned this in the essay too, is we shouldn't think about across the board kind of approaches to crime and its control, that we should think more strategically. I mean, to use a medical analogy, you need to have triage, because these things aren't uniformly distributed. What works for low rate offenders is not going to work for high rate offenders. You don't want to spread the police out equally across the city. And you don't want sentencing to be the same regardless of someone's criminal history. I mean, it's just like the way we treat other things, that where you have, skewed distribution, you have the consequences are really high by place, suggests we got to really think more about kind of, crime control strategies, even early childhood strategies that are way more focused kind of at, what's driving the rate. And seems so obvious, but it's one of the reasons I wrote the essay. I was kind of frustrated by the fact that I don't hear these discussions enough in policy. People talk about, eliminating this law or reducing that, and I think, okay, but what about for the high rate offenders? Or we're going to have a special exemption to this type of crime. And I said, well, but offenders don't specialize. So, if you kind of go through the list, you'll realize why, it's pretty obvious why many of the policy discussions aren't consistent with the facts of crime.
Yeah, I mean, I want to just give listeners a sort of more granular sense of just how concentrated crime is. I mean, here in New York City, every year, about 3.5% of our street segments see about 50% of all the violence. And the street segment would be, sort of one side of a city block, corner to corner, 2 sidewalks, right? That's one street segment. We have about 82,000 street segments in, sort of publicly accessible street segments in New York City. And 3.5% of them consistently see 50% of the violent crime. About 1% of them see 25% of the violent crime. And that's a pattern that you see not just here in New York, but in cities across the country, indeed across the world. And again, within those places, crime affects a very, very small subsection of those communities, right? So you're really talking, particularly with violence, you're talking about young men, really between the ages of, say, 15 and 35, that sort of constitute probably around 90% of the victims of serious violence, particularly gun violence, and also the perpetrators, right? And there's a lot of overlap between those two groups, victims and perpetrators, which is something that's probably underappreciated. So, let me know if I missed anything important there. But the question that I want to ask with that in mind is it possible, when you sort of think back on the sort of conflict of visions that we're seeing play out in the field of criminology, that part of why, I don't know if this is the right word, but maybe part of why so many criminologists are so cavalier about defanging the sort of enforcement institutions, police and prosecutors and correctional departments, is part of it potentially just the fact that they don't have any real world experience in any of those places because they're so unlikely to come from them or really spend a lot of their time, and understand what it's like to live in a community in which you sort of are consistently fielding the threats that are posed by the local gang or the local drug crew, and sort of internalizing the fears that members of those communities maybe feel on a more regular basis. Do you think that that's maybe part of the disconnect that we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, in general, there is a couple of things have happened. One is we don't have the same kind of ethnographies that we used to have from people like Eli Anderson, who would spend time in a really disadvantaged neighborhood and write about the social context. The ethnographies people tend to write now are more focused on inequalities in the criminal justice system. So we don't have that. So sometimes people don't have the real world experience, but maybe they can get the context from a really well done ethnography. We don't also have the media reporting the same way we used to, of kind of, somebody who's the crime reporter who's talking to the lay people on the street, giving you the context. So I think that's shifted. And the third thing is more and more academics don't do their own field research anymore. They don't go out, they don't collect data in the community, they don't talk to people, average people in the most disadvantaged environment. So I think, that can be sheltered, from information from multiple directions, academic, media institutions, and also just kind of that practical experience you get through doing field research. I think that really makes it easy to kind of be naive to the consequences of crime in a given community. Because I can tell you, recently I was in one of the most disadvantaged in terms of violence neighborhoods in Philadelphia, Kensington, and I was talking to someone who works for Community Group. And he was really saying, effectively hey, he doesn't, he wasn't focused on the cause of crime, but just saying, hey, there's people are experiencing trauma here, multi-generational, but it's gotten worse because there's very few consequences for illegal gun carrying. And when you have a community like this, and he's from the community, he's like, there's got to be consequences, because otherwise, you don't want people who are traumatized carrying around guns and are edgy and willing to shoot each other. I mean, seems so commonsensical, right. But if you're not in one of those communities, or you don't spend any time there, I think it's really easy to be kind of naive and think that, effectively, because, people writing this work often don't have any skin in the game to kind of use, Warren Buffett, term. It's so, you can be wrong and you don't suffer any downside consequence. So I actually think we need more work where good ethnographies, we need people spending time in the field, and listening to people who, getting their lived experience in those communities, to get a sense of what is it really like. Cause it's missing. And I don't say you can change major newspapers, but it would be great if we had crime reporters in some of these papers again that spent time really in the community.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. It's as you were saying that, I was thinking back on a speech that your colleague, Professor Anthony Braga, just gave here at the Manhattan Institute for the fourth annual Kelling lecture, and he was telling a story about doing some field work I think it was in Boston, and he was doing a ride along, and they were responding to something that had happened in a park, and then he saw George Kelling on a bicycle with bicycle cops doing his own field work. And it was just, it was a story about George Kelling. It was, again, just a giant in the field. And, but one of the things that he always said, and that he said to me before he passed, was just, it's really, really important that you actually get on the ground and talk to people, that you go in, that you feel it, that you smell it, that you get a sense of it. And I think you're right. I do think that that's just something that's not particularly emphasized in the research community anymore. And, maybe that's just because it's not what's rewarded. And I do think, the more I think about it, the incentives have kind of shifted. Like you said, there's really this focus on social justice and focusing on inequality, and the work that gets celebrated is whatever advances, that narrative that, the system is inherently unjust, and that, we can sort of propose some solutions to make it more just, and, by comparing what exists to our sort of ideal that doesn't exist anywhere in the world. And what gets left out is the sort of real world situation in communities like Kensington and places, on the north side of Philadelphia where, arguments get settled with shootouts. And, I think more people in the community do need to have a sort of deeper sense of that. How do you change that? You're I'm sure overseeing some brilliant PhD students and young and upcoming scholars. What do you tell them? How are you thinking about sort of influencing the field moving forward?
Try to get them to focus more on any aspect where you can collect your own data. Even survey data is valuable, because not Mechanical Turk, not online, but like where you can actually go and interview people or be involved in that process. You learn something. You learn how the sausage is made. And you also learn to, be skeptical sometimes of like how good this data set actually is, and you understand. So I try to encourage them to get involved in collecting their own data, or look for policy shifts that are consequential and study those, and then talk to people. Like, try to connect with people in agencies, in nonprofits, hear what there's. It might not go into your regression model, but at least you have a clear understanding of the institutional details, because I think that's important. There's often blinders when people don't, and be willing to have a result that isn't consistent with your own ideological beliefs. That's fine. Science often can tell people what they don't want to hear, but that's the point. Challenge those assumptions, and if you find something that's inconsistent, publish it anyway. That's but but focus on science, the quality of the rigor of the science. And I think in the long run, pendulums of kind of worldviews tend to swing back and forth in different directions. And at least you go to bed at night knowing that you did the best work you can do.
So as I was thinking about more about the 7 indisputable facts of crime and offending, in preparation for our conversation today, I wanted to sort of get a sense of how, some of these might play against one another or interact with one another. And, two of the things that I was really focused on was this idea that criminal offenders tend not to specialize, right? And how that interacts with the reality that crime is very, very hyper concentrated among sort of small, tight-knit social networks of high-rate offenders. And when I was thinking about how those two things interact, I mean, the thing that kept coming up in my head was, well, this is why it's so important for us not to take serious consequences off the table, even for what I think a lot of people would term low-level or nonviolent misconduct, because what that means is that a lot of times the serious high rate offender, the person who poses the biggest risk to the community, when they're before the system, they're in front of a judge and in a courtroom, usually for something that's going to be nonviolent or quote unquote low level, but that doesn't mean that they are nonviolent and that they aren't low level, because again, there's really no such thing as the offender that just says, I only kill people, right? I don't litter, I don't deal drugs, I don't do any of these other things, right? So the person who could be a killer tomorrow may be in front of the court today on a drug dealing rap or on a car theft rap, or maybe they steal a car in order to use it in a drive-by later on, or so I mean, what do you think about that sort of broader debate that in my opinion makes the following mistake, which is that it references these categories of low level and nonviolent offenses as if the people who sort of make up those categories are static, right? As if there's no overlap.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think one of the problems is because of the lack of specialization, you can have a high false, well, I'll call it false negative rate, which is you think like, oh, these people are at low risk, but usually they've already revealed their preferences. Somebody has a really long rap sheet of arrests and convictions for serious things. There was a lot of criticism of using probation revocations, but one of the, benefits of a revocation can be a probation officer knows this person's at serious risk of committing and they've made a violation and they can get them back, constrained, either back into jail or, maybe even prison if it's a more serious offender. And I think, by creating these across the board kind of categories, you have a lot of false negatives. You have a lot of people that are actually, cycling through and the consequences, because it's not a simple random sample, that people on the right tail, that's high rate offenders are going to drive the crime rate up. I mean, I think it's pretty true just mechanically if you think about it that way. So yeah, I think it's an oversight, and that's even true within the highest crime places. So those street blocks, right, segments you mentioned, street segments in New York, it's a handful of people on each segment. The people on those blocks that are in fear of them, they know who they are, and often the police know who they are, and they certainly know the address because they get called there again and again and again. And so it's like you wouldn't want to say, okay, treat someone the same who's on a burglary charge who has one prior, somebody has 50 priors, and 2 of them are armed robberies. So I mean, it's kind of obvious. I mean, we have these sentencing systems usually with criminal history built in historically, and you can say maybe some of them are too draconian on the margin. But the idea that you would just eliminate whole categories, it's just inconsistent with the facts of crime.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of been one of my biggest critiques of modern day bail reform initiatives, because, what they tend to do is they take pretrial detention off the table for really, large categories of offenses based on the idea, well, this is a nonviolent offense or this is a low-level offense. And what that does is it forecloses the possibility of acknowledging that, yes, this person before me right now is here today for a nonviolent offense, but I can see their criminal history and identify them as a significant risk. And, the question I always have for people is like, well, shouldn't we want the system to be able to make that assessment, that individualized assessment, and say, okay, yeah, you may be here for a nonviolent, quote unquote, low level offense, but you are not a nonviolent low level offender. And so you're going to go in pretrial. Whereas, maybe somebody else who's here with, on the same charge doesn't. I mean, I think that's a mistake. So question one is do you agree? But question two is, do you think that's just a function of fear that people have in trusting criminal justice system actors with that kind of discretion?
Yeah, I think, I agree with you. The principle is it's very ineffective. It's also fundamentally not fair, if you ask me, to treat people the same who have different criminal histories. You wouldn't do it in almost any other context. Now, I can see, we used to have debates about when you should sunset criminal history. So Al Bloomstein, Sean Bushway, that's pretty good work to suggest, maybe at 7 years, the risk of reoffending doesn't look much different from the rest of the population. So maybe you don't count if the criminal history if it was 10 years ago, unless it's something super serious. But we don't seem to be having those debates. And I think part of it is just easier to recommend policies that are across the board. They're easier to implement. There's less nuance, and it's easier to declare victory. Okay, we passed this law. You're a nonviolent, offender. So we're going to say nonviolent offenders. But then if you think about so we're going to consider burglary. So maybe that'd be an example. But most convicted rapists have a bunch of burglary charges. How do you think, they go about what they're doing? Often breaking into houses. So the idea that you're well, it's just a burglary offense. But then you find the person has, a prior rape conviction. I'm sorry, but that should be a pretty clear signal that this person's a different risk. And that seems to get, you talk to people about this that aren't in our field, and they're like, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, but, what's interesting is the policy discussions are often at a higher level. Oh, yeah, they're nonviolent offenders, so they're no risk, but they don't provide that nuance. I could see having an assessment where you're okay, this is truly someone who has no prior. This is the first offense. We're going to give them a break. But that's not who's driving the crime rate. And that's also not who's driving the incarceration rate either. People forget how much of the incarceration rate gets driven by not just repeat offenders, but a surge in crime. If you have more people coming in because of crime, Sean Bushway also has some good research on that, showing that how much of the cohort drives the crime rate. It's unbelievable how much of the drives the incarceration rate. How much of it you can show is just in a given cohort of young man at a given high crime period. And then they develop that criminal history. And then, and you can tell because the age of people in prison has gotten much older. So it's from, the early 90s generated huge, there was a mass incarceration, but it wasn't across the board. It was really conditional on which cohort you're in.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I've been thinking about too is I wonder whether part of the story with respect to the aging of the prison population is just a function of the buildup of incarceration in the 90s and so and 2000s. And so, what happens is that a bigger chunk of people on the street with opportunities to offend are people who used to be in prison, and because we started imprisoning more people for longer, they're also older. I don't know how much of it sort of explains the broader population trends, but it's something I've thought a lot about. I want to talk more though about just crime concentration at place and within networks, social networks, because I think it has really broad implications for what I suspect is one of the more powerful rhetorical points of debate in terms of criminal justice policy that has helped kind of sort of lubricate the field for the shift toward, more of a focus on social justice and inequality. And that's race in particular. There's no debate about criminal justice policy that doesn't at some point get into the realities that criminal enforcement is disparate with respect to its impact on various racial groups. Again, I was just testifying before the Civil Rights Commission that we were the hearing was primarily focused on racial disparities in violent victimization, but been involved in lots of conversations where it very quickly turns to disparities in enforcement. We're told, for example, black men in the United States are about 5 times more likely than their white counterparts to be incarcerated. With respect to police use of force, black men constitute about 7% of the population, but about 24% of deadly police shooting victims. That's an overrepresentation statistically. And so that, I think, the focus on overrepresentation tends to drive a lot of criminal justice policy discussion. But I mean, how do we square that focus on overrepresentation with the realities of crime concentration? I mean, what we're consistently seeing in the data is that crime is happening in very, very small subsections of our cities. If in fact those subsections see overrepresentations of certain racial groups in those geographies, I mean, what are we supposed to make of the disparities in enforcement that happen within those places if we want the system to be responsive to where crime happens?
I mean, I think if you think about the inequality by place in intergenerational concentration of disadvantage, joblessness, you can think about older, scholars like William Julius Wilson's, stable underclass. You would then expect there to be inequalities also in the criminal justice system that, are context, depending on those places. And in fact, I've got some work with Roland Neal. We have a paper in criminology and public policy. We show, like, in New York, Chicago, LA, as much as 30% to 40% of the racial disparity in arrests you can account for by just 5% of places in each of those cities. Mm. So, I mean, if you could figure out what to do in those 5% of places, right, to reduce crime substantially, you could cut, so the kind of point is, most of New York City, there isn't tremendous inequality in who's being arrested by race. Same with Chicago, same with LA. Chicago, a little bit more because of kind of the hyper concentration of segregation, disadvantage in the South and West. But still, it's driven by kind of these pockets of crime. It's disproportionate. You could cut inequality. So, but that requires some hard thinking about what are you going to do in these places? What are you going to do to change the built environment? How are we going to do how are people going to do enforcement? What are the approaches that are going to work? And so I think sometimes people lose sight of that. They just see an inequality, a disparity by race or ethnicity, and they just think it's true for everyone of that group. And it's just not.
Right. Now, as I think of your work and through the thesis of this essay, right, social control works. Well, if that's true and social control works, which I think it does, and that it is, and that those social control initiatives are focused in the places where crime concentrates and among the networks of high rate offenders that are really driving the crime rate in those places. Isn't it also true that, yes, you might see some inequality with respect to enforcement, but you're also going to see some inequality with respect to whatever benefits attend the reality that social control works? Yeah.
So if you say that, you have a focused deterrence approach that really clamps down on those networks and gets some of those offenders to desist, and maybe some of them are incarcerated, right? That incarceration rate in that place might go up on the margin, but the disparity in who's being victimized is going to go down a lot. I mean, Pat Sharkey, you mentioned him earlier, his work that shows, the crime drop in the 1990s added almost a year to life expectancy for black men. I mean, that's on the order of like a major public health achievement. Now, that wasn't for the average black man. That was for black men living in the most disadvantaged environments in these cities. So I think, and you can see that in the data from 2020, that it's the spike in homicide is hyper concentrated. This was, I'm sure, in your, in congressional testimony, but it's not just concentrated by race, it's concentrated by race and place and within those networks. So I think it's fundamentally to think about how those things interact. Social control also can start early. I mean, you can think about early childhood interventions, good school-based interventions in the most disadvantaged places, family-based interventions, summer jobs for kids, how you scale all these things is challenging, but, urban renewal and redevelopment, strategic kind of things, and also enforcement, focused deterrence for people who have, committed serious crimes, incarceration. And we know that for active offenders, that reduces crime from both the incapacitation standpoint, and maybe we don't have as good evidence on the on empirically of deterrence, because it's kind of hard to separate the two from each other. But I mean, you just know that for some people, the margin on the right tail of the distribution, it's going to work. It's going to reduce the number of people being shot in a community. So I think the idea that, that of thinking more strategically about the social context is fundamental, and how social control, and, some of those social control interventions are things that people, who are interested in, inequality, could maybe wrap their arms around if they realize that, that they are helping on that side too. I mean, if you prevent a kid from a life of crime, he or she is going to be involved in work. They're going to be more likely to go to college. They're just, the life outcomes are going to be so much better that it seems like it's a failure to think that the criminal justice system is causing all the inequality.
Yeah. No, I mean, as I've kind of thought through the root cause debate, my sense has been that, there is a root cause story that I buy. It's not, the sort of socioeconomic root cause story. I don't think, necessarily that it's the case that, poverty causes crime, in part because, there are a hell of a lot more poor people than there are criminals. So that's a starter. But I do think that, early childhood experiences connected to the family in particular, kind of along the lines of what Robert Sampson has found in his work, are really kind of important. And I've got a paper coming out this week, actually, co-authored with Joe Price and Brad Wilcox, where we look at the relationship between family structure and crime, and kind of look at cities that are above and below the median share of households headed by single parents, and find very consistently that, those above the median have way higher crime rates, way higher violent crime rates, way higher homicide rates. And we do the same analysis within the city of Chicago at the census tract level, and break out the census tracts that are above the median for single parent households, and below the median, again, above the median, just massive differences in terms of crime and violence. And, there are a lot of potential explanatory stories for that, but one potentially convincing one, I think, is just that the family is an institution in which good informal social control can happen. And if it happens early, that will help facilitate the social development of those being raised within those institutions. And if that socialization process, succeeds, if it doesn't break down, that really over time dramatically reduces the likelihood of anyone coming out of those households committing crime and getting, into those cycles of violence that, all too often just spell a death sentence for entire neighborhoods sometimes. So as people, are listening to this and sort of thinking through, how they might contribute to some of this work if they're in the field or, if they're journalists kind of working adjacent to the field. I mean, what's your sort of closing message to the field of criminology, to, criminal justice journalists like myself? I mean, how should we be thinking about these things moving forward?
Yeah, I think what's really important is not to return totally to the 7 facts, but think about what the kind of facts of crime are. And then what are the programs and policies that we actually have that we've tried out? We have some evidence of them working or not working. And then, and then what can we learn from that in terms of going forward? And I think that's a challenge. So, what is it about place, the networks, the concentration of people? Given those kinds of facts, and the lack of specialization, and even the seasonality of crime, what is it about the routine activities of place and people and the social environment people are living in, and like you mentioned, the family environment? Okay, we can't change the marriage rate overnight, but what are things that, it's hard to be a single parent. Like, what are the resources, and the programs that will be effective for, buffering, providing the social bond kids need, and focusing on that, focusing a lot more strategically about, and if you're in the media side, writing about those places, what is it like? Because you're right, it's not just as simple as income. It's the connection of the social environment someone's raised in, and that you talk to anybody who's grown up in an environment like that, they'll tell you how hard it is in some ways to avoid things because of the social context. Now, most kids do. So what's working well? The parents focusing on have to be home at a certain hour, this kind of social constraints. And then, writing about that, thinking about what the right policies are for kind of trying to we already have good evidence of what works. But, we need newer evidence. Do you know what I mean? We don't want to rely on evidence from 20, 30 years ago. So I think, going forward, we need more people trying to do things in the field in the most disadvantaged places, and try to reduce the serious consequences of crime.
Well, I wish we could have this conversation go another hour, but time has unfortunately flown by us. So I just want to say thank you to you, Professor MacDonald, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
And for those of you listening, if you enjoyed this episode and you found this information helpful, please, I do encourage you to follow the Manhattan Institute and its work, particularly the work of the Policing and Public Safety Initiative, which you can find at Manhattan Institute's website, which is at a new URL, manhattan.institute. Of course, I'd also encourage you to follow Professor MacDonald's work, which you can find on Google Scholar and at the University of Pennsylvania Department of Criminology. If you liked this conversation in particular in this episode, please consider liking and subscribing to the podcast and leaving us a rating on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks so much.